Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about Japan's strategic shift in policy toward Taiwan. And here to do that, we have Pamela Kennedy from the Stimson Center and Ryan Ashley, who's an Air Force intelligence officer. And we also have as our moderator today a new face at FPRI. Ryan Newhart is our new Associate Deputy Director in our Asia program. And his research focuses on security issues related to military, economic, and technology developments in the Indo-Pacific region. Prior to joining FPRI, Ryan was at the Hudson Institute, and he has an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in International Relations from the College of William and Mary. I will also say that Ryan is going to be very much involved in the new China Center that we will be launching early in 2022. So please stay tuned for that. This is a very important new initiative for FPRI. If you have questions today, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions from the audience at some point toward the latter half of the program. So finally, before I turn it back to Ryan, I'd like to say a special thank you to our friends and supporters in the audience. We can't do this without you, so please consider making an end-of-year tax-deductible donation. Anyway, without further ado, let me hand the reins over to Ryan. Take it away.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Raleigh. As Raleigh mentioned, I'm Ryan Newhart. I'm the Associate Deputy Director for the Asia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Today, we're going to be discussing Japan's evolving Taiwan policy. And we're going to start with a moderated discussion with some basic questions I've prepared. Then we're going to move to a moderated audience Q&A period at the end. If you're in our live audience, please use the Zoom's Q&A function to start submitting your written questions. And when we reach the Q&A period, I will select as many of those questions as I can, time permitting. At FPRI, we really want our audience to be included in the conversation. You always have great questions. And so we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to provide your input so that we can make sure that we're discussing the topics that you're most interested in. Now we have two phenomenal experts here today, Pamela Kennedy and Ryan Ashley. Pamela Kennedy is a research analyst with the Asia program at Stimson, where she works on several projects related to Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and China. She recently co-authored a summary of the Track 1.5 dialogue that Stimson hosted for US, Japanese, and Taiwanese officials and experts that focused on maritime safety cooperation. And in September, she moderated a great panel called Changing the Discourse on Taiwan, Japan-Taiwan Ties in 2021. So she's very well versed in the topics we're going to discuss today. Pam has a master's in international relations and international economics from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's in government and East Asian studies from the College of William and Mary. And Ryan Ashley is our other panelist. He is completing his PhD in public policy at UT Austin's LBJ School of Public Affairs, and he frequently lectures on Japanese politics, culture, and security. In November, Ryan wrote a great article for War on the Rocks called Japan's Revolution on Taiwan Affairs, which examined many of the topics we're about to delve into. He has a bachelor's degree in public policy and history from George Washington University, a master's in security studies from Angelo State University, and another master's in Asian studies from Georgetown University. He's also an active duty Air Force officer, and I would like to take this moment to emphasize that he is here speaking in his personal capacity today. Any views he expresses today are his own and don't represent those of the Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other part of the US government. Now, with all that out of the way, I think we can dive into our discussion. So I think I'm going to throw my first question to Ryan. Just to get us started and to level set, I think it would be helpful for us to briefly recap Japan's historical position on Taiwan and then walk through some of the key developments we've seen this year in Japan's statements and their engagement with Taiwan and how it's changed.
Absolutely. So Tokyo and Taipei have had a trajectory of relations that'll be pretty familiar to those who have seen the relations that Taiwan has with the world following the sort of revolution that occurred with the recognition of the PRC from the Western world and the democratic side of the Cold War. So in 1972, Tokyo and Beijing restored relations following a joint communique and negotiations that were initiated by Prime Minister Tanaka. The specifics of that communique stated that the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China, and stated as well that Japan fully respects and understands the PRC stance that Taiwan is a, quote, inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China, but never clearly laid out Japan's own stand, providing that sort of level of ambiguity that was typical of a lot of countries that switched the diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. From that point on, Japan took a fairly passive stance towards some of the conflicts that arose between Beijing and Taipei. If you were to look at some of the public statements that were made by the Japanese Foreign Ministry from the late 1970s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, if you would make a word cloud out of those, hope would probably be the largest word, and peaceful, probably the second largest. You had a consensus in Japan that was pretty widespread across certainly the Liberal Democratic Party, the governing party for the majority of this period, which essentially stated that the focus on relations with Beijing has to be keeping economic relations sort of cordial and functional. You had enough geopolitical tension between Japan and China already, whether it was over disputed islands in the East China Sea, so the Senkaku Value dispute. You have, of course, disputes over historical memory from the Second World War. You had a series of other sort of bilateral trade spats. So the focus was there's no reason to involve Tokyo in another conflict, certainly one that is, Beijing's most sensitive topic of all international relations, which is the Taiwan dispute. So that is changing now. I personally characterize it as a revolution because of some of the statements and words that we're seeing. But I do want to stress that while policies themselves have not formally changed, you have not seen anything written down in formal law saying that Japan has changed the consensus that it reached with China in 1972. You have seen a large shift. So I'll give an example here quickly. In 1999, you had a right-wing nationalist governor of Tokyo named Ishihara, who referred to Taiwan as a state. And throughout this consensus from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you did have individual politicians, typically from the right wing, who would latch on to Taiwan as an issue. The Foreign Ministry publicly rebuked him for saying this and sort of denigrated him as just a local official who had no influence over Japan's policies. Over the last few years, you've had similar statements coming out from now senior leaders in the Japanese government. You've had the Deputy Defense Minister stating that Taiwan must be, quote, protected as a democratic country. You have the Defense Minister state that the peace and stability of Taiwan are directly connected to Japan. For the first time since 1969, a joint statement between the US President and Japanese Prime Minister mentioned peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And then since I wrote my article, there's been the big one of all, which is former Prime Minister Abe came out and stated that, and this is my own personal translation of the word he used, but that a Taiwan contingency is a contingency for Japan and a contingency for the US-Japan alliance. That word UG can mean emergency, but I personally have seen it used as contingency, which has very specific alliance meanings. So you've had this great shift in the language that's used and a break away from the consensus that was formed beginning in 1972.
Thank you very much. That's a great characterization of what we've been watching. Pam, if there's anything else you would like to flag as what you think are significant shifts in Japan's policies, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I think we can also start talking about some of the motivations that are causing Japan's leadership to kind of shift and recalibrate their position towards Taiwan. So Pam, if there's anything you'd like to add, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. I will just briefly add that I think one of the most important developments in what I've been calling a renaissance, but I like revolution as well, in Japan-Taiwan relations is the inclusion of a little separate section discussing Taiwan's security environment in the Defense of Japan white paper that came out this summer. And that's a first, separating the Taiwan issue out and directly relating it to Japan's own security interests. But that's a great summary. Thank you, Ryan.
Great. Yeah. And I imagine also the meetings between party officials and other kind of slightly less official meetings between Taiwan and Japan are also significant to kind of point out that these are increasing in frequency. So after this, maybe Pam, you could start talking about some of the factors that might be causing Japan to make this kind of shift. Why are they recalibrating their position? Why now? What is the thinking in Tokyo about Taiwan?
That's a really great question because, yes, it definitely begs the question of why is this occurring now? And it really has been the development of several factors. First, there is a shared security concern between Japan, Taiwan, the United States, other democracies in the region about China's activities in the region, which are perceived to be destabilizing, such as military exercises in the Taiwan Strait, incursions into Japanese and Taiwan's air and maritime areas, There's also a growing affinity between Japan and Taiwan specifically as two democracies who have helped each other out during the pandemic and who generally have positive feelings towards each other, poll after poll says. There's also a desire to deepen the existing economic ties between Japan and Taiwan, and this itself has several sub-reasons. The supply chain resiliency issues that we've seen cropping up during the pandemic. There's a developing Japanese policy to improve its economic security and also integrate Taiwan into regional trade pacts like the CPTPP. And fourth, of course, it is also the right timing in domestic Japanese politics, as Ryan noted, that Sino-Japanese relations are currently in a cooler phase and Diet's support for Taiwan is at a high. That is, of course, a trend that changes over time, and it does not mean that Japan is trying to further chill relations with China, but simply manage them so that it can also develop this unofficial relationship with Taiwan further. I think that would be my brief thought. Are there specific issues in there? I should go into further detail.
We can circle back, but I think Ryan, also in your article, you mentioned a few other factors that are kind of prompting Tokyo to make this shift related to the broader trend of internationalizing the issue, Japan's vision for its leadership role, and domestic politics in Japan. So if you could elaborate on those points, I think that would also be helpful.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Pam that this is the right time domestically for Japanese politicians to embrace closer relations with Taipei. You're seeing that in polls, both in Taiwan and Japan. But something I noted in my article, which is just to add on to what Pam mentioned about bringing Taiwan in on trade pacts and international agreements, is this cycle that is occurring in Japanese foreign relations as a whole, but Taiwan specifically, which is Japan embracing a larger role in this thing we call the liberal international order, which is probably an entire presentation in itself to break down exactly what that means. But on top of that, you have an internationalization of the Taiwan issue to where the Taiwan dispute is no longer focused on as sort of a trilateral disagreement between Beijing, Taipei, and Washington. You have Europe, specifically Lithuania recently, which opened a trade office with Taiwan and has now been roped into the conflict. You have a number of other leading countries in the world outside of the region who have taken the Taiwan issue and taken it from a regional security issue to an international issue of democracy and liberal order at large. And so for Japan, which is a country that over previous decades is seen as a bit of a laggard in the liberal international order, is now really taking a leading role. Japan is leading the reboot of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Japan is leading a number of regional integrations with Southeast Asia. And Taiwan is, besides just an issue that is important domestically to Japan, another one of those international issues that Japan seeks to lead on. So as Japan seeks a larger international leading role, and the Taiwan issue itself is increasingly internationalized, it creates a sort of feedback loop that incentivizes further collaboration and cooperation between Tokyo and Taipei.
Great. Yeah. And I imagine also part of the factor motivating this shift is just that the probability of a conflict has, increased as China has gained the ability to potentially conduct some kind of offensive operation that would have a chance of success. And as we have a more ambitious leader in China with Xi Jinping, who may be more risk tolerant and may be more willing to actually take some kind of offensive action against Taiwan. So this threat has become increasingly real, and that may also be prompting Japan to take more seriously a more serious look at its deterrence posture. I think Pam, you've mentioned before how this ties into Japan's security interests and how a Taiwan conflict could affect Japan's own national security. So that also might be a point that's worth elaborating on here real quick.
Absolutely. I think that in Japan, the public, but especially Japanese political leaders, are increasingly aware that Taiwan is geographically a part of Japan's own security environment. It's very close. Taiwan is located along what we call the first island chain, very close to many of Japan's small southwestern islands, part of the Ryukyus. And in this area, the East China Sea, which borders the South China Sea, over the past decade or so, there has been an increase in Chinese maritime activities. This includes building artificial islands in the South China Sea, sending out fishing vessels or maritime militia vessels. It's often hard to tell the difference between them, and having encounters with vessels from the other maritime countries along Southeast Asia and up to Japan. For Japan, this activity has been a rapid increase in the maritime and air incursions, especially in the areas around the Senkaku Islands, which are claimed by Japan, China, and Taiwan. So in Japan, I think the Ministry of Defense is very concerned with the frequency of these incursions, which really raise the tension in the area and pose a risk of miscalculation or some kind of accident in the air or at sea that could potentially escalate. So when Japan made the decision to incorporate Taiwan's security situation into the defense white paper, that is confirming that Japan sees Taiwan's security as integral to its own. I think that's what's behind like former Prime Minister Abe's comments that like a Taiwan contingency would affect Japan. It certainly would, just because of the geographic proximity. And by acknowledging this reality, Japan can voice support for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and also contribute to deterrence against Chinese actions that could potentially destabilize the situation. Like Ryan said, it's very important also for just Japan's more active regional and global role, because these issues of maritime security set precedences that are applicable across the globe. They're not just contained to regional security issues. They're going to be very important for international law at sea in general. So that is how I would summarize that.
Great, yeah. And as we kind of think about maybe potential next steps, what we might see later down the line coming out of Japan, are there any specific examples of cooperation that we are likely to see in the years ahead? I know, Pam, you recently hosted a Track 1.5 dialogue that discussed maritime cooperation. Maybe that's one potential area where we could see closer Taiwan-Japan collaboration. And in the military space, we had a question come in from Michael Deckard asking if there's anything that, in your opinion, that we should see Japan or Taiwan doing more in the bilateral defense space. So maybe that could tie into maritime cooperation, maybe other forms of defense cooperation. We can start with Pam and then we'll throw to Ryan.
Those are great questions. I think in the maritime security, or rather maritime safety realm, because military to military cooperation or even defense ministry to ministry cooperation between Japan and Taiwan is difficult, if not impossible, under the nature of their unofficial relationship. But there are several ways that Japan and Taiwan can work together to maintain stability in the East China Sea. And that was the subject of the Track 1.5 that we held at the Stimson Center a couple months ago, was exploring some options for specific methods of cooperation. And Coast Guard cooperation is gaining a lot of interest this year. Coast Guard cooperation, or even communication. The US and Taiwan have already a good model for this. There's a new US-Taiwan Coast Guard working group established just this year, and perhaps Japan could observe the working group and consider its own mechanism for communication with Taiwan's Coast Guard. Of course, the goal of maritime safety cooperation would be to improve communication, share information, and just generally reinforce stability in the region. It could include the information sharing on Chinese vessels in the area, but also on Taiwan and Japan's own Coast Guard activities to provide better maritime domain awareness. And there's always an expectation that China will condemn any sort of deeper cooperation as pushing the line of unofficial relations between Japan and Taiwan. But I think that this sort of low profile cooperation that supports regional stability is appropriate for actors in the region who have an interest in maintaining that security environment. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Ryan, I'll throw over to you. Are there any forms of cooperation that you expect to see between Japan and Taiwan? Anything that you think they should be considering doing?
So I completely agree with Pam that the idea of formal military to military, Ministry of Defense to Ministry of Defense type cooperation isn't very likely because of the informal relationship, and also because of Japan's own domestic constraints for the overseas use of military force, whether for conflict or just exercises. That is a very sensitive topic in Japan, which is typically focused on using the self-defense forces in Japan for peacekeeping or for exercises with bilateral alliance partners, or alliance adjacent partners. So that Australia, the Philippines, the United States, and India are the countries that we pretty typically see Japan do exercises with. I think moving up to Taiwan isn't very likely, but the Coast Guard space, the law enforcement space, the security and safety space seems really ripe for cooperation. The talks that were launched between the two governing parties in Japan and Taiwan from earlier this year specifically mentioned the potential for Coast Guard to Coast Guard exercises, focusing on things like humanitarian support and personnel recovery, which seems like a very ideal space that could take place at a more unofficial level, focus on providing public goods and safety, like humanitarian support, and happen at that sub-defense level at the Coast Guard level, which would make it more comfortable for both the external and internal political reasons in both Taiwan and Japan. So I think the Coast Guard space specifically seems like the right place for this to move forward for the next steps, and that's where I'm hoping to see more.
Gotcha. And then I think it would also be helpful to kind of talk about what this means for the United States. If we see Japan having a growing interest in Taiwan security and moving forward with more forms of cooperation, how does that affect U.S. strategy towards Taiwan, toward China? How does that help us with U.S. planning for Taiwan contingencies? Does it have maybe in terms of basing access or other factors that the U.S. is trying to consider when we're planning for a Taiwan contingency? I'll start with Ryan, and then we can throw over to Pam.
Sure. So the first thing I would like to point out is that these shifts are taking place in Japan for reasons that are pretty domestic or internal to the Japanese government. I don't think this is an example of, as we say in sort of the Japan setting, both gaiatsu, or sort of outside pressure that is forcing the Japanese government or Tokyo to do something they would not have otherwise done. The motivations for closer relations between Japan and Taiwan come from Japan's own interests, its own security interests, economic interests, desire for leadership in the liberal international order, and for its own sort of shifting consensus on China. So while this is bringing Japan and the United States into closer alignment on their views towards Taiwan, it's important to remember that Japan is doing this for reasons that are relevant to Japan, and that this is complementary for the U.S.-Japan alliance, and that's where this should really be focused on. So specifically, I mean, to bring it back to Coast Guards, I think Coast Guards, I think law enforcement cooperation, that level of just below the military of defense, security, safety cooperation is the right place to see this, and that is an ideal space from a U.S. perspective for Japan to really involve itself.
Yeah, and Pam, do you have anything to add?
I agree completely. These working level, law enforcement agency level cooperation really are the space where there's so much room for expansion, and they would have, I would hope, a measurable impact on the stability of the area. Of course, talks between the US and Japan on Taiwan scenario responses are obviously private, so I don't know what they involve, but I'm sure that those conversations are ongoing. And it's just important to keep in mind that, like Ryan said, Japan's self-defense forces are governed by really strict laws that constrain their abilities compared to how the US forces operate. So it's a very complex situation in terms of what Japan is legally allowed to contribute. And what analysts can focus on improving as well is these closer ties between Japan and Taiwan that help to reinforce norms along with relations with the US, strengthening deterrence, supporting the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that the Japanese government puts forth as the liberal international order for the region, including freedom of navigation and stability. So since the US has also adopted this VoIP concept, they're very closely aligned. And in some ways, I think, as well as a side note, the US-Taiwan relationship does offer a model for how others like Japan can have this deep yet unofficial relationship, including the Coast Guard Working Group and other forms of cooperation that are within the guidelines of the Taiwan Relations Act.
Yeah, and kind of building off that point, the point that this is being driven domestically, not externally by the United States or other countries. To the extent that it's still something that's welcome in the United States, is there anything that the United States should do to kind of facilitate this cooperation? Is there a way that the United States could play a constructive role without applying any kind of pressure to either party? And is there anything that the United States should avoid doing that could be, counterproductive? So maybe we could start with Ryan and then go to Pam again.
Sure. So something I wrote in my article, which I think would be counterproductive, is focusing on Japan shifting its formal policies or laws or authorities of the self-defense force to work with Taiwan, instead of just simply incentivizing the goods that are happening independently of US pressure. So for example, there's a lot of discussion both inside Japan and outside of Japan having its own version of the Taiwan Relations Act, which is something that did not occur when Japan flipped its relations from Taiwan to China in the 1970s, but something that did happen in the United States. There was a legal guarantee of certain assurances, certain levels of support that the United States would continue to provide to Taiwan. Japan did not do that in the 1970s. And you're seeing some calls within the governing Liberal Democratic Party and also sort of externally that Japan should go in that direction. And I think that isn't the right idea to focus on. I think Japan's relationship with Taiwan shows that you can have robust ties and you can have a revolution or renaissance in relations between your two countries without bringing the sort of legal authorities forward that seem to be more important from a sort of policy or legal perspective. But meaningful ties can take place below that space when you focus on things that aren't big and splashy on headlines like military exercises, but things that are really deep and meaningful and provide public goods like law enforcement and Coast Guard cooperation, which are the two buzzwords that I think are very important there. So I think for the United States, this offers nothing but upside, essentially. The closer relations you have between Tokyo and Taipei, the more you're bringing a strategic vision into alignment between Washington and Tokyo. And so this is something that has been happening without our pressure and something that we should not necessarily involve ourselves in any way except to help facilitate and to help move along this process that's already taken place.
Pam, is there anything else that you would add? How would you characterize, a constructive role for the United States and anything that we should, actively do, anything that we should avoid doing?
I agree with Ryan, and I will add that there are existing trilateral platforms that the US is part of, which already do really great work in expanding Taiwan and Japan's opportunities for cooperating. There's the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, which is a workshop series conducted trilaterally. I believe it started in 2015, 2016, but Japan became a full host member in 2019, joining the US and Taiwan. And that's a really interesting opportunity for experts from the three partners to step forward and hold workshops on a wide variety of topics for experts from other corners of the globe. There are also trilateral dialogues, as we've seen. There may in the future be opportunities for observing each other's military exercises. And I think that these sorts of opportunities are the most important for the United States to provide to encourage Japan and Taiwan's ties. I agree that it's not really necessary for the US to dictate how Japan-Taiwan relations should evolve, because they are already part of a very long and deep engagement that has lasted decades since the end of the war. And Japan and Taiwan both have their own interests in cooperating with each other. I do think that it's important to plan trilateral engagements with nuance. Some forms of engagement help to raise the awareness of Taiwan and Taiwan's interests around the world and help to expand Taiwan's international partnerships. But other forms of engagement can yield relatively little benefit for relations with Taiwan while also drawing retaliation from Beijing. So picking and choosing how to deepen relations is something the Japanese and US governments need to be continually figuring out as they move forward. There's so much experience across the State Department with managing the careful balance that I'm sure that will continue.
Great. And then maybe the last question before we start our audience Q&A, just how durable do we think these shifts in Japanese posture are going to be? Do we expect them to continue to expand their cooperation with Taiwan? Is there a risk of backsliding that we should watch out for? maybe if there was ever a change in leadership in Japan, what factors should we be watching for in terms of thinking about how durable these may be? We can start with Pam and then kick it over to Ryan.
Well, of course, I don't know what the future will hold, as the pandemic has shown us. Everything can always change, but I don't think that Japan will maintain this pace of regular statements from prominent political leaders about Taiwan necessarily, unless there's maybe a significant increase in Chinese maritime activities that crystallizes a sense of urgency about the East China Sea. But I also don't think that there will be a return to the quiet approach to Taiwan that we saw in previous decades. I think that now we have a new baseline that is solidifying in Japan, in which it's acceptable to discuss like Taiwan's position in Japan's security environment. There won't be a need to pretend that these spheres of security are somehow separate by a really narrow margin of water. But more important, I think, is the level of dialogue between Japan and Taiwan. I'll be watching next year to see whether some of the talks that happened in 2021 will be repeated, such as the ruling party conversation from this summer, any legislative exchanges or trilaterals with the US. Those sorts of talks represent some substantial progress that Japan and Taiwan can use to improve cooperation while still keeping the relationship beneficial. And I agree there will be no progress on a Japan-Taiwan Relations Act.
Ryan, if you have anything to add, go ahead.
Yeah, Pam put that perfectly. I actually wrote down a note that said a slowdown in revolutionary statements does not equal backsliding. I think that what we're seeing here is the establishment of a new baseline, but I do think it is durable. Ryan, you mentioned the potential of new leadership maybe changing this baseline. I think that the current leadership of Prime Minister Kishida shows that there is a new durable consensus in Tokyo on foreign policy at large and towards Taiwan specifically. You know, Kishida is not known as a foreign policy hawk in his early parts of his career. He came up as a junior member speaking about the need for balance in the trilateral relationship between the US, Japan, and China, which is typically a code word for let's focus more on cordial relations with Beijing than sort of involving Japan in informal disputes. But as prime minister, he speaks about increasing Japan's strike capabilities, that's missile capabilities in the Western Highlands. That shows that there is, in my opinion, a sort of secular shift in foreign policy in Tokyo at large, and I think Taiwan is at the front line of that shift in foreign policy. What I will be looking at is the agreements that were made in the party-to-party talks earlier this year, those Coast Guard exercises that I'm going to keep mentioning because I think they're very important. If those go ahead, I think that'll show that there is a good, durable new consensus on this topic. And any sort of long-range postponing or cancellation, or if those are scaled down, I think that would represent a form of backsliding. But overall, I do think that we are at a new baseline here, just like Pam said.
Gotcha. All right. Well, with that, we're going to transition to our audience Q&A. So for our first question, we had an anonymous submission. Is part of Japan's recalibration due to a perception that U.S. support for Taiwan is wavering and a vacuum needs to be filled? Or is this mostly other factors kind of motivating the shift, some of the factors we talked about earlier? So this is back at thinking about Japan's motivations. Do you see any evidence that there's some doubt amongst Japan's leadership or public that there's some kind of gap in credibility in the U.S. Commitment to Taiwan? We could start with Ryan and then go to Pam, maybe.
Sure. I don't think that there is something that specific. What you have seen in the shift in Japanese foreign policy over the last 5 years or so is a perception that the United States could be, withdrawing, or non-credible are words that I think are too strong, with the idea that the United States presence in the Indo-Pacific is, on a relative sense, dropping in compared to China's. You can't count on overwhelming level of influence and power in the Asia Pacific as you could maybe in the 1990s. And so Japan needs to explore not alternatives to the United States, but ways to complement the American presence in the region. So I don't think that this is something specifically where there's a concern about a lack of US commitment towards Taiwan, as much as a larger realization that the United States is not going to go it alone in the region forever. But that is the consensus in Japan. That's not my own characterization. I think that's a good sort of summary of the ways discussed in Japan. And so Japan must bolster that US presence, assert its own leading role in the liberal international order with Taiwan as a part of that. So I think if you zoom out and view the region as a whole, that'll better explain this process than some sort of specific credibility doubts for specifically US Taiwan.
Gotcha. Yeah, and Pam, is that kind of your read as well? Do you have anything to add?
I would actually say that my reaction is the opposite. Well, the opposite to the way the question is posed. I think that U.S. support for Taiwan is at an unusually high level right now. Although for decades, of course, there's been very strong bipartisan congressional support for Taiwan, so it's never really been in question. But especially during the Trump administration, we've seen the passage of so many acts relating to support for Taiwan in the economic and people-to-people engagement, as well as record levels of arms sales. And I think Japan might have seen this and also taken it as a sign that this is an opportunity to also deepen Japan's own relations with Taiwan, that there is this growing consensus among democracies led by the US that supporting Taiwan is appropriate in these methods. And in terms of a vacuum, though, I have heard in Japan various opinions regarding the US policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan that can create some questions about what does this mean for US credibility in the region? Is the US going to show up if there's a conflict or not? And there are different views on that in Japan from Japanese strategists and policy analysts. But I don't think there's the perception of a vacuum necessarily.
Gotcha.
And if I could just jump in quickly there, Ryan, sorry. Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with Pam's characterization there. And the idea of a sort of strategic anxiety in Tokyo about Washington maybe pulling back from the region is nothing new. You saw it in the 1970s after the withdrawal from Vietnam. You saw it in the 1990s when Japan was typically in the headlines as a sort of trade rival of the United States as opposed to a security partner. So this is nothing new, and it's very precedented. There's been decades of conversations in Japan about the need for Japan to build its own capabilities and to involve itself in the region because of the potential of a sort of withdrawing United States, which I do not think is personally, I don't think that that's the case, but we're talking about the perceptions in Japan.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe building off that point, is there anything that you've heard or read in related to that topic in terms of what the United States could or should do to maybe reinforce confidence in our commitment to the region at large and towards Taiwan and towards Japan's security? Is there anything that we're not doing now that we should be doing? We start with Ryan and then shift to Pam. It's a hard question, but yeah, anything we could do to reinforce Japanese confidence.
Yeah, and I don't want to paint the picture of in Japan, there's this widespread doubt about American commitment to the region. I think it's actually quite the opposite.
Yeah.
But that some recent U.S. politics has played into a long-standing trend in Japanese views towards the United States, which is anxiety over the United States leaving the region and sort of leaving Japan on its own, which is something that has happened for decades. The only point that I would make here, without wading too much into U.S. domestic politics, is an expansion of U.S. economic involvement in the region, specifically the CPTPP, which is now a Japanese-led trade initiative. I think that would represent a sort of full spectrum commitment to the region, expanded from just security or specific security points to a larger commitment. A U.S. return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now the CPTPP, to me would represent an incredibly credible step in the minds of strategists in Tokyo. I think that is the number one thing that I see mentioned personally when I read articles about U.S. commitment to the region from leaders in Japan.
I agree. I think that it is largely the economic component that could use some improvement at the most right now. Bilateral trade agreements, but especially these regional trade pacts are so important for showing that the U.S. Is sort of all in on investing in the region and building stronger trade relations with every country, giving more options than just China, who is the largest trade partner of pretty much every country in the region.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Carlos Rivers, kind of pertaining to Japanese domestic opinion. So, to what extent does this policy shift align with the political support or have political support domestically in Japan? Is this a case where the leadership are getting out a little bit ahead of the domestic population, or are they kind of being pushed by the popular opinion to take a more assertive position on a Taiwan contingency? We can start with maybe Pam and then go to Ryan.
Sure, I think that they're moving together. Japan, the population in Japan and the population in Taiwan have for many years had very strong sentiments towards each other, very favorable, amiable sentiments. And I think that has been growing. And despite the pandemic, which has prevented the high levels of tourism that we're moving back and forth between the two, we've seen instances like Japan donating vaccines to Taiwan when the COVAX facility wasn't able to deliver the promised amount. And earlier, Taiwan delivered face masks during the face mask shortage to Japan. And Ryan also mentioned in his excellent article, the pineapple situation, which was so fascinating, seemingly a spontaneous occurrence in which China stopped importing Taiwanese pineapples. And so Japanese people picked up the slack, sort of just buying these pineapples from Taiwan. There are a lot of instances like that, and that is what leads me to believe that the Japanese leadership is really following along with this growing public sentiment in Japan, that Taiwan is a fellow democracy, there are good feelings between the two, and it's worth supporting.
Yeah, and Ryan, would you characterize that in the same way, or do you have anything to add?
I certainly would. I completely agree with Pam. To get to those public opinion polls that were mentioned, I don't want people to think that there's public opinion polls suggesting that the Japanese people, when asked, hey, should Japan involve itself in a military conflict over Taiwan? You have a majority saying yes. You would never get a poll to give you a majority there. What you find is, somewhere, sometimes nearly as high as 74 or 75% of Japanese respondents saying that Japan should involve itself actively in order to promote peace and stability. So the overwhelming desire, I would argue, from the Japanese public is that Japan should be involved with this country that has such close person-to-person ties, economic ties, cultural ties, like Pam mentioned, in the furthering of peace and stability. And the government is focusing its efforts mostly on working along those lines, hence you're seeing more Coast Guard, less self-defense forces, right? So the view in Japan is never going to really focus on Japan involving itself in a military conflict. I want to just really stress that. The focus is always on Japan fulfilling international commitments, being a trustworthy partner, and promoting peace and stability.
Gotcha. Kind of also thinking about the flip side of whether these shifts will be durable or not. It seems like in Japan, there's a lot of forces that suggest that there will be a lot of continuity, even if there is a leadership change. But thinking about Taiwan's leadership, if there's a leadership change in Taiwan, is there any kind of a risk that could derail the direction of closer cooperation between Japan and Taiwan? And if so, how likely do you think it is that we could see that kind of a leadership change in Taiwan that would bring a significant enough political change to cause some kind of effect on their cooperation with Japan? So maybe start with Ryan and then throw to Pam.
I think that is a space that's really important to watch. The unofficial sort of government level or government adjacent level conversations that are happening are at the party to party level, right? So you have the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan speaking with the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. If that were to become a KMT government in the future, there isn't as close of a relationship between the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan and the KMT in Taiwan. So you would be starting from the beginning in some cases to try to rebuild some of the trust between party leaders and maybe even on some of the agreements that were made about future collaboration. So I don't foresee a government change in Japan anytime soon, but I will note that in the most recent Japanese election, some of the largest opposition parties were essentially in line with the LDP on policies towards Taiwan. So you had, for example, this is just to name one, party called Ishin no Kai, which set itself up as an opposition party, but if you look at the foreign policy, was if not aligned with the LDP, perhaps even more assertive about building more relations with Taiwan. So I don't think a leadership change in Japan would shift this, but I do think one in Taiwan has the potential to not necessarily be sort of a counter-revolution for the revolution or stop the Renaissance, but would be an inflection point because we would have to see some pretty tough choices made in this party-to-party conversation.
Pam, yeah, would you characterize that the same way? Do you have anything else to add?
I agree. I think that the KMT is in a really tough spot right now, trying to shore up its domestic base when the issues have really changed from what the KMT looked like in the Ma period, 2008 to 2016. And so I think the KMT's sort of decisions on where its party platform will move in regards to cross-strait relations, and then Taiwan's other relations around the world will be the main factor there. I don't think there would be any huge shift in how the government on Taiwan approached Japan, because there's so many strong economic and cultural ties there. People-to-people engagement is still really strong, and the government can't simply turn that off. And I also don't think the KMT has any incentive to do so necessarily. I will note that sometimes if there is anti-Japan rhetoric in Taiwan, which is very unusual, it's political rhetoric in sort of a campaign season context. And that's very different from a party taking power and then governing and managing the unofficial relationship with Taiwan. I think one area that we do need to watch in the future would be the Japan-Taiwan trade agreement, the bilateral trade agreement, setting aside CPTPP for the moment. There's the issue of food imports from the Fukushima area, which has repeatedly come up as a sore point in these discussions, because in Taiwan, there's a very strong hesitance to eat any of this food, which has been called like nuclear food, even though 10 years out from the 3/11 disasters in Japan, the food has generally been found to be safe for consumption. So depending on how that issue turns out over the next few years, that could potentially be a stumbling block in these trade relations. That we'll have to see whether this is resolved during the Tsai administration or in the next government.
Right, and I think we've got time for a few more questions. So we've had a number of questions about whether this could kind of catalyze or help accelerate the trend of internationalizing the Taiwan contingency issue. So Abigail Bard asked, do you think this is going to bring on a trend in which other regional players also express increased support for Taiwan, say South Korea or ASEAN member states, or do you think Japan is relatively unique here? I think we've already kind of started to see this with the joint statement from the G7 summit. There was a language about peace and security in the Taiwan Strait included in the statement between Biden and Moon earlier in the year. But yeah, anything that either of you could say to kind of elaborate on whether you think this would be, the start of a broader trend in many other countries kind of expressing greater support for Taiwan. Let's start with Pam and then throw over to Ryan.
I think this is a really tricky question with a lot of nuances, especially for the ASEAN member states. All of these states have very close ties with China as well, very important trade relations, and their hedging behavior between China, between the United States on many issues. Taiwan is just one of these issues. So while these states do already have very close development relationships with Taiwan, we'll see how far they can go in terms of expressing support. I think that's support for something like peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, something that is pretty bland, and everyone can agree that that is much better than the alternative of any sort of conflict or accidental collision. But in terms of a trend, I think that, yes, we will see more states around the world voicing support for Taiwan, but it will depend on how those countries also manage the relationship with China at the same time.
Yeah, and Ryan, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I completely agree with Pam's framing. I do think that there is a unique opportunity here for Southeast Asia, for the ASEAN member states. From a Taiwanese perspective, if the desire is to sort of internationalize the dispute over your status, it's hard to find a more ideal partner in doing so than Japan. Japan, a country that is uniquely respected and viewed positively, with, of course, some very notable exceptions, South Korea, China. But in Southeast Asia and in Europe, Japan is viewed very warmly by publics, governments, defense establishments, economic organizations alike. And that's uniquely true in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. Japan has levels of access in the heights of economic and defense leadership in Southeast Asia that other countries simply don't have. So I think that there is a lot of room for Taiwan, ASEAN dialogue on topics like trade, migration, labor, COVID, and from there, the sort of sub-security issues like law enforcement and Coast Guard adjacent spaces could be ripe for some level of cooperation. So while I'm not sitting here predicting that could happen, Japan is an ideal partner for Taiwan to have credibility in Southeast Asia, or to move forward on those mutually beneficial relationships over sort of human security topics.
Gotcha. We had a question from Thomas Gold, asking about what Japan's position toward the debate in the U.S. over strategic ambiguity as a policy towards Taiwan is. So any insights into how Japan thinks about either, I guess, the U.S. changing that posture or a Japan shift from strategic ambiguity towards a more clarified position. I think this kind of touches on what Ryan was saying before, where it's unlikely that Japan has an appetite for changing their official policy, and that the U.S. probably shouldn't encourage them to do so. And I think that it seems to be the conventional wisdom in the United States as well, but there is a growing minority that's arguing for a change to strategic ambiguity. So maybe we could start with Ryan and then throw to Pam. Do you have any, does it seem like there's any kind of growing support for Japan changing their policy, official policy, or maybe Japan encouraging the US to change our official policy?
It's definitely a difficult question. Pam, I'd be curious if you've seen anything along these lines, but frankly, in reading Japanese media, I don't think Japan really discusses the issue along these lines. I don't think that there's a lot of time spent just discussing very strict adherence to communiques from the 1970s, to put it simply there. I think the focus is more on the ground, concrete cooperation that can occur at that unofficial level, with a very small minority saying that there should be some level of a Japanese-Taiwan Relations Act that would still in itself not result in any change in overall strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. So I don't see a lot of debate in Japan about whether the United States should or shouldn't change a policy of strategic ambiguity. And I don't think the Japanese debate is really concerned as much with legalities and policies as much as it's concerned with real on the ground cooperation, whether it's economic, defense, or otherwise.
I agree with that. I think the only, questions I've seen in Japan about strategic ambiguity is what that might imply for U.S. commitment. Of course, part of the confusion comes from the very public debate that occurs on all of these U.S. policies in Washington. This has happened repeatedly with various policies or drafts of policies when all the think pieces come out, and it can sort of muddy the waters on where the U.S. is going. I don't think the U.S. is also likely to change the policy of strategic ambiguity, but from the Japanese perspective, reading Washington media, it can appear that this is like an actual debate that's potentially going to result in a different policy in the near future. I don't think that is the case. But I think that there will continuously, like Ryan said, be concern in Japan over the strength of US commitments in the region, to Japan specifically under the alliance, but also what the US security commitment to Taiwan is to provide the means for Taiwan's self-defense per the TRA. And it's the US's responsibility to assure Japan that the US-Japan alliance is watertight, and that the US has a variety of economic and social and military commitments in the region that will maintain an active presence.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So kind of thinking back towards opportunities for more cooperation between Japan and Taiwan, we have a question from Helen Yu. She asked, there was a recent article in the Asia Times stating that Taiwan is looking to indigenize its semiconductor equipment manufacturing. Do either of you foresee that Japan and Taiwan and their economic and technological relationship will strengthen because of that move? Could economics and technology essentially provide other opportunities for cooperation between Japan and Taiwan? Could you see forms of economic cooperation? I know, Ryan, you mentioned earlier the CPTPP, or any other kind of trade relationships. Those could be foreseeable forms of, closer cooperation that we could see in the future. Are there any other specific, signs that there could be economic cooperation or technology cooperation between Japan and Taiwan? We can start with Pam and then throw to Ryan.
I think this is a great question because there has been the recent news that the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is already building a large factory in Arizona, and there are plans to build another in Japan. So clearly Taiwan is interested in not only indigenizing its semiconductor and high-tech sectors, but also bringing those supply chains directly to key partners like the US and Japan. And I think this is a very promising sign for Taiwan's economic relationship with Japan as well as the US. And it's very important as well for the economic security concerns that have been developing over the past few years in US and Japanese policy. So I think especially in areas of like preventing technology transfers of technology that are critical for national security. This is just one element of that larger issue that's going to improve economic security for all three sides.
Ryan, would you add anything to that, or is that essentially your view as well?
That is absolutely my view as well. You're seeing a large prioritization in the defense space with the two most recent prime ministers in Japan about technology sharing. When you see headlines about a big defense deal is signed between Japan and, let's say, the two recent examples, Vietnam and Indonesia, the specifics of those are often on technology transfer agreements. And so the recent $7 billion chip plant that TSMC is going to build in Japan, it's certainly no coincidence that the two largest plants that are being constructed by TSMC outside of Taiwan are in the United States and Japan. I think that is a clear conflation of strategic economic resources with defense and technology and economic relationships all built into one. And so that offers nothing but upside.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, are there any other important points that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet? Anything that you want to circle back to and kind of emphasize before we close out this discussion? We can start with Ryan and then throw to Pam. Any additional points you'd like to make? It's okay if we've covered it already.
No, I think the final point that I will close on is a point that I made previously, which is about Japan building a relationship with Taiwan on its own terms and for its own sort of geopolitical reasons, and to not view Japan as sort of joining in or not in on a security priority from an American perspective, but viewing it from Tokyo's own perspective. If anything, if you look at language like Free and Open Indo-Pacific or even Build Back Better, these are phrases that originated in Japan, not the United States, that got picked up by American politicians. So I think viewing the Tokyo-Taipei relationship and zooming it out, it serves as an example of allies and partners of the United States, arguably perhaps even leading the way when it comes to a model of behavior that the United States should be engaging in Asia. So it's just one example here, but I think that there is a broader relevance of the Japan-Taiwan relationship, which is where you see allies and partners of the United States sort of building up an order and building up a security relationship that is highly complementary with the United States without necessarily the US sort of pushing anyone or very visibly leading the way.
All right, and Pam, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the discussion?
Sure, I will just briefly say that I think over the next year, it'll be really interesting to see how Japan continues to deepen its cooperation with Taiwan, but also how that influences, I think, some of the other states we're seeing in other regions, especially Europe, also voice more support for Taiwan and international organizations and show more interest in the region, which I think is really important for regional stability. And so it'll be extremely important to see some progress coming out of this really unusual year in Japan-Taiwan relations and carry that forward. So I hope there is some substantial progress made in some talks, maritime safety cooperation, but also showing greater interest across the world for Taiwan's international participation in key organizations, which Taiwan really needs to be a contributing member of the international community, WHO, ICAO, others like that.
All right, well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up the discussion here. Pam, Ryan, thank you so much for setting aside time to speak with us today. To all those joining us live or after the fact, watching this on YouTube, thank you for watching. FBRI, as Raleigh mentioned at the top of the program, FBRI has a lot of exciting plans for the Asia program in 2022. We're planning to launch our China Center. More details will be coming out about that later in the month. And we're going to be significantly scaling up our work on China in the years ahead. So stay tuned for that. Please go check out Pam's work at Stimson and Ryan's publications in War on the Rocks, The National Interest, The Military Times. I don't know, Pam, Ryan, if you want to plug anything else before we sign off. Pam, if we can start with you, if there's anything that you want to direct our audience towards. Otherwise, we can wrap it there.
You can take a look at the Stimson Center's report on the maritime safety trilateral between the US, Japan, and Taiwan. It's a really interesting readout.
And Ryan, anything you want to plug?
No further plugs, just happy to be here, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you guys again for joining us. And with that concludes our program.